You have mistaken your suffering for sanctity. This is the paradox that shadows many lives, believing that endless forgiveness is the highest virtue, while in truth, it can be the most invisible chain. The empath, that sensitive figure who feels the atmosphere of a room before a word is spoken, is not always born from divine light. Often, they emerge from the trembling soil of survival. In the earliest years, a child learns to watch carefully. The silence of a mother becomes prophecy. The anger of a father feels like scripture. To stay safe, the child learns to absorb, to soothe, to forgive before the offense has even been spoken aloud. But this survival mechanism, left unchecked, becomes a creed. As adulthood arrives, the empath does not realize that forgiveness has become their armor and their prison. Each apology offered for wounds that never healed, each excuse made for someone else's betrayal, slowly builds a mask of peace, a mask of compassion, a mask that hides the rage of the abandoned child still burning underneath. And here lies the dangerous illusion, believing that if they stop forgiving, they will stop being loved. That illusion drives countless choices. An empath forgives the narcissist because they see the wounded child behind the cruelty. They forgive the betrayer because they imagine redemption waiting around the corner. They forgive again and again because they fear that to withhold mercy is to lose connection. Yet each act of forgiveness offered without discernment chips away at their own truth. The empath becomes like a sponge, absorbing poison and calling it purpose, mistaking endless endurance for holiness. The truth, however, is more severe. Forgiveness that costs you your authenticity is not healing, it is self-abandonment. When mercy becomes compulsion, it stops being sacred. Jung understood this pattern as a distortion of individuation, the process of becoming a whole self. Instead of moving toward wholeness, the empath dissolves into the needs of others. They turn their back on their inner child, who longs for acknowledgement, and instead serve the illusion that compassion means silence. But there comes a rupture, a sacred breaking point where the soul, exhausted from turning the other cheek, turns inward. In that moment, forgiveness ceases to be an obligation, and discernment takes its place. This rupture is not vengeance, it is awakening. It is the threshold of individuation, the instant when masks begin to crack and the true face of the self whispers through the fractures. Imagine standing at that threshold. You see how your kindness has been weaponized against you. You see how your light has been siphoned to feed the shadows of others. You see how your belief in infinite forgiveness has bound you to people who never earned your grace. And this vision terrifies you, for it means recognizing that you have not only been deceived by others, you have deceived yourself. Yet terror is not the end. It is the beginning. Because in facing this fear, you begin to understand that to stop forgiving blindly is not cruelty. It is clarity. It is not coldness. It is consciousness. The moment you step away from compulsive forgiveness, you no longer play the role of the sponge. You become the mirror. You stop absorbing what is not yours, and you start reflecting truth. That truth is uncomfortable, sometimes unbearable, but it is real. And only what is real can heal. As you listen now, I invite you to reflect on your own story. Where have you confused compassion with erasure? Where have you called silence love? Where have you offered forgiveness not out of freedom, but out of fear? Let those questions linger, for they are not accusations. They are invitations. Invitations to begin the journey that countless empaths fear. The journey of becoming whole rather than endlessly agreeable. And if you are watching this far, Let me ask you, comment below where you are watching from and what time it is right now. It reminds us that this is not an abstract idea, but a living story unfolding across the world. And if you find meaning here, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so that you never miss a new step on this journey. This channel, Carl Jung Stories Unveiled, is not about theories trapped in books. It is about the fire of truth spoken into everyday lives. So let us continue. You have heard the first shock. Forgiveness without discernment is not strength but bondage. From here, we will descend deeper into the origins of these masks, forged in childhood, worn in silence, and carried through relationships that demand your light while refusing your boundaries. Masks are rarely chosen. They are forged in the furnace of survival, shaped by moments when a child felt unseen, unheard, or unsafe. For the empath, the mask of peace was not a costume donned for vanity, but a shield required to endure. A mother's withdrawn silence, or a father's unpredictable anger, pressed upon the child an unbearable weight. If I can sense the storm before it breaks, maybe I can stop it. If I can forgive the wound before it bleeds, maybe I will be safe. And so the mask was born. This mask looked like compassion. It looked like harmony. To others, the child seemed gifted, able to soothe tensions, quick to reconcile, endlessly forgiving. But beneath the surface, the truth was different. These skills were not gifts freely given. They were survival codes written in fear. The empath learned to anticipate needs before they were voiced, to disappear their own feelings before they were inconvenient. They created an identity around being good, being kind, being endlessly forgiving. As the empath grows older, the mask hardens. What was once a flexible response becomes a fixed identity. I am the forgiver. I am the peacekeeper. I am the one who absorbs pain so others don't have to. This persona is praised by society, romanticized as holiness, yet Jung would call it a persona, an adaptation to the external world, but not the truth of the self. A persona can shield, but it also deceives. The more an empath identifies with the mask, the further they drift from the authentic core hidden beneath. These masks do not only protect the empath, they protect others. They protect the narcissist from accountability. They protect the betrayer from consequence. They protect the manipulator from being seen. By hiding their anger, by silencing their needs, the empath allows every other mask in the room to remain intact. Forgiveness offered too quickly becomes complicity. Silence offered too easily becomes permission. And yet, why do empaths continue to maintain these masks? The answer lies in the unconscious fear that without them, they will not be loved. If they say no, they risk rejection. If they set boundaries, they risk abandonment. The mask of peace becomes the price of belonging. But this belonging is counterfeit. It is not connection. It is dependency. To understand how deeply these masks shape the empath, consider the language of dreams. Wolves wearing the faces of lovers, broken clocks bleeding through empty rooms, locked doors that cannot be opened. These images rise again and again in the unconscious. They are not random nightmares. They are psychic alarms. They signal that forgiveness has become a prison and that the mask no longer conceals safety, only suffocation. Every empath has felt this tension, the rage that simmers beneath kindness, the grief that lies beneath the smile, the exhaustion that comes from carrying everyone else's wounds while hiding their own. To confront this reality is terrifying, because it means admitting that the very qualities they were praised for, sensitivity, forgiveness, peace, are rooted in pain. Yet this admission is the doorway to healing. When we speak of masks, we are not speaking of deception in the malicious sense. We are speaking of defenses, brilliant, necessary defenses that once kept a child alive. But survival tools are not meant to be lifelong identities. What once protected you may now be destroying you. To grow is to question the mask. To awaken is to risk letting it fall. You may be wondering now, if the mask has been your face for decades, what lies beneath? The answer is not simple, for it involves both darkness and light. Beneath the mask lies the abandoned child, still angry, still longing, still raw. But beneath the child lies something even more radiant, the authentic self, the divine spark, the part of you that does not need forgiveness to be loved. This is the core Jung described as the self, the center of wholeness that integrates shadow and light alike. The tragedy is that many empaths never reach this point because they fear the fall of the mask more than the slow death of their truth. But masks, no matter how carefully crafted, will eventually crack. Life, in its wisdom, ensures this. Through betrayal, through loss, through dreams too vivid to ignore, the unconscious calls the empath to a reckoning. The choice then becomes clear. Cling to the mask until it shatters painfully, or release it willingly in pursuit of authenticity. What happens when the empath begins to loosen the mask? The shift is seismic. The silence they once offered as peace becomes a roar of truth. The compassion they once offered as erasure becomes discernment. The forgiveness they once offered without pause becomes sacred choice. This transformation does not destroy love, it refines it. Love without boundaries is martyrdom. Love with boundaries is sovereignty. And so, as you listen now, reflect on the masks you have worn. How many times have you smiled when you wanted to scream? How many times have you forgiven when you needed to walk away? How many times have you mistaken compliance for connection? Each mask has served you once, but it does not need to define you now. The empath's masks are not the end of the story. They are only the beginning. For when they finally crack, and they always do, the sacred rupture arrives. And it is in that rupture, not in the mask, that true individuation begins. There comes a moment when the weight of all the masks becomes unbearable. It is not chosen consciously, nor does it arrive gently. It is more like a fault line in the soul, quivering until one day it splits. This is the sacred rupture, the instant when the empath cannot sustain the illusion of harmony any longer. Forgiveness once given as instinct now feels like poison. Silence once praised as peace now feels like suffocation. And what was once a survival strategy transforms into a crisis of identity. In this rupture, the empath discovers that every mask falls. Not just the masks of others, the charming predator, the repentant abuser, the manipulative friend, but their own mask as well. The persona of the forgiver, the peacekeeper, the endlessly compassionate one cracks open. Beneath the polished surface emerges something raw and disorienting. Anger long buried, grief long denied, and truths too sharp to be silenced. This moment is terrifying precisely because it contradicts the story the empath has told about themselves for years. They have believed they were born to heal others, to absorb shadows, to forgive infinitely. To realize that this belief was never destiny but a defense is like losing the ground beneath your feet. And yet Jung would remind us, the fall is necessary. Individuation does not come through clinging to illusions. It comes through the shattering of them. Consider how the rupture reveals the cost of endless forgiveness. The empath recalls the countless times they swallowed truth to keep peace, apologized for wounds inflicted upon them, or offered mercy to those who had no intention of changing. These memories return not as bitterness, but as brutal clarity. They illuminate the betrayal not just of others, but of the self. Each moment of self-abandonment gathers in the heart like sediment, and when the rupture comes, the floodwaters sweep it all to the surface. Yet this reckoning is sacred. The grief that follows is not weakness. It is alchemical fire. It burns away the false persona and forges the soul in gold. When the empath weeps, they do not weep for the betrayer or the manipulator. They weep for themselves, the self they left behind at the altar of approval. In that grief lies the seed of transformation, and transformation begins with the smallest word, no. To say no to the narcissist, no to the endless cycle of abuse, no to the fantasy that love can fix what refuses to change. Each no is not cruelty, but clarity. Each no is not a wall, but an altar, a sacred space where truth is finally allowed to stand. The rupture also exposes the illusions the empath once worshipped. They grieve the fantasy that their love could heal the unhealed, that their kindness could reform the cruel, that their forgiveness could substitute for accountability. These illusions die hard, for they have been the foundation of identity. But when they fall, something unexpected emerges. The soul resurrects. The empath realizes that to walk away is not abandonment of others, but a return to themselves. Jung called this the path of individuation, the death of the false self and the birth of the inner sovereign. And the rupture is its threshold. To cross it is to face both terror and liberation. On one side lies the comfort of masks, the familiar prison of false peace. On the other lies the fire of authenticity, the daunting freedom of living without illusion. You may wonder, what does this look like in everyday life? It looks like declining to answer a manipulative call. It looks like choosing solitude over one-sided intimacy. It looks like refusing to smile when you want to scream. Each act is small, but together they declare a revolution. I will no longer betray myself for the sake of belonging. And what of those who once relied on the empath's masks? They will resist. The narcissist will rage. The manipulator will twist. The needy will accuse. To them, your no sounds like cruelty. To them, your silence feels like exile. But this is their reckoning, not yours. For the first time, they are left to face their own shadows without the buffer of your forgiveness. The performance ends when the audience walks away. The sacred rupture is not the conclusion. It is the invitation. It asks, will you cling to the familiar persona, even though it destroys you, or will you step into the uncharted territory of selfhood? This is not a single decision, but a series of choices repeated daily. To speak the truth when silence is easier. To walk away when staying feels safer. To risk being misunderstood in order to remain whole. If you are listening now, perhaps you feel the tremors of this rupture within yourself. Perhaps you have noticed that forgiveness no longer feels holy, that compassion no longer feels clean. That is not failure. That is awakening. It is the beginning of a deeper path where you no longer confuse endless endurance with love. The masks are falling, and though it feels like destruction, it is in fact creation. For in the rubble, the authentic self stirs, whispering through the fractures. You were never meant to be food for their shadows. You were meant to bring light to your own. This is the sacred rupture. From here, the journey turns inward, into the shadowed corridors of the psyche, where buried rage, hidden grief, and forgotten power wait to be reclaimed. And it is there, in the dark, that the empath discovers sovereignty. To step into the shadow is to descend into the most feared yet fertile territory of the psyche. This is where the empath, stripped of masks and illusions, finally meets what has long been buried: anger, resentment, grief, and unspoken truths. Jung described this confrontation as shadow work, the sacred labor of integrating the parts of the self once denied. For the empath, shadow work is not optional. It is the only path to reclaiming sovereignty. Imagine years, even decades of swallowing anger. Each moment you said, "It's fine," while your soul screamed otherwise. Each time you offered forgiveness to avoid conflict, that unspoken rage sank deeper into your unconscious. There it waits, smoldering, shaping your dreams, leaking into your relationships. It does not vanish. It transforms into fatigue, anxiety, or resentment. To enter the shadow is to stop pretending these feelings do not exist. It is to say, "I see you. I will not abandon you again." Shadow work terrifies the empath because it feels like betrayal of their identity. To admit anger seems to contradict the role of the forgiver. To feel rage feels like becoming cruel. Yet this is the great misunderstanding. Anger is not cruelty, it is clarity. Rage is not evil, it is the alarm of a soul demanding respect. When integrated, these emotions are not destructive, they are protective. They establish boundaries where none existed. They ignite discernment where blindness once prevailed. Consider the symbolism that often surfaces in dreams during this stage. Wolves wearing familiar faces, houses with locked rooms, broken clocks bleeding across walls. These images are not nightmares to fear, but messages from the unconscious. They warn, your forgiveness has become a cage, your silence a wound. They insist, it is time to confront what you buried. And when you face the shadow directly, the dreamscape shifts. The locked room opens. The wolf transforms. The bleeding clock stops. In this descent, the empath encounters the child within, the abandoned self who learned that pleasing others was the only way to be loved. That child still remembers every silenced truth, every swallowed word, every betrayal disguised as devotion. Shadow work is the act of kneeling before this child and saying, "I see you, I will not erase you again." To honor the inner child is to begin healing the original wound, the one that birthed the compulsion to forgive endlessly. This is the paradox. The empath, once terrified of anger, discovers liberation in embracing it. For the first time, their no is not followed by guilt. Their boundaries are not apologies, but declarations. They begin to recognize the predators cloaked in charm, the manipulators cloaked in praise. They see them clearly, and clarity itself becomes unmasking. The narcissist cannot manipulate what you no longer hide. The abuser cannot exploit what you no longer excuse. Shadow work also exposes the difference between wounds and weapons. Many empaths forgive harmful behavior because they see the pain behind it. They believe that to acknowledge the wound is to excuse the cruelty. But shadow work teaches discernment. Seeing pain does not obligate you to endure abuse. Compassion without boundaries is not love. It is self-betrayal. By reflecting rather than absorbing, the empath shifts from sponge to mirror, from martyr to sovereign. Of course, this shift comes with loss. Those who depended on your silence will resist. They may call you cold, unforgiving, arrogant. They will accuse you of changing, and in a sense, they are right. But the change is not the loss of your soul. It is its restoration. You have not become cruel. You have become clear. You have not abandoned love. You have abandoned illusion. As you continue deeper into shadow work, you begin to see how much of your identity was built around the needs of others. You recall how often you mistook projection for prophecy, emotional starvation for unconditional love, consistency for care. Each recognition is painful, but pain is the fire that purifies. In grieving these illusions, you step closer to truth, and truth, though it burns, does not destroy. It liberates. You begin to forgive differently, not as performance, not to keep the connection, but as release. You forgive when your soul is ready, when the wound has spoken, when the truth has been honored, not a moment sooner. This is divine timing, not emotional obligation. What emerges from shadow work is sovereignty. The empath no longer seeks redemption in the eyes of others. They no longer give power away in the form of compulsive forgiveness. They no longer measure their worth by how much they can absorb. Instead, they embody the archetype of the mirror, reflecting truth without distortion, standing firm without apology. If you are listening now, perhaps you recognize the stirrings of your own shadow. Perhaps you feel the anger you have hidden, the grief you have silenced. This is not a sign of failure, but of awakening. The shadow is not your enemy, it is your teacher. And when you honor it, you discover that the darkness you feared is not meant to consume you. It is meant to complete you. Shadow work is not the end of the empath's story, but it marks the beginning of a new chapter. For once you reclaim your buried emotions, you cannot return to false peace. You cannot unknow your own power. From here, the path leads into mourning, the grief of illusions lost, of fantasies buried, of connections surrendered. It is through this mourning that the inner child is finally restored, radiant and unashamed. Grief is often mistaken for weakness, but in truth, it is the sacred passage that follows awakening. Once the masks have shattered and the shadow has been embraced, the empath enters a season of mourning. This grief is not merely for others, it is for the illusions that once defined their life. To awaken is to bury the fantasies that kept you bound, and each burial demands tears. The empath grieves the relationships built upon unspoken compromises, where silence was called love and endurance was called loyalty. They grieve the fantasies that their compassion could heal the unhealed, that their devotion could transform cruelty into kindness. They grieve the hope that love alone could replace accountability. These were not trivial illusions. They were survival stories. To let them go is to let a part of oneself die. Yet Jung would remind us, individuation requires death of the false so that the authentic may rise. In mourning, the empath discovers that grief itself is transformative. Each tear shed for illusions lost becomes a baptism. Each sob for the self once abandoned becomes an initiation. Grief burns like fire, but cleanses like water. It strips away the false comfort of fantasies and makes room for the authentic self to emerge. At the heart of this grief is a reunion, the rediscovery of the radiant inner child. For years, this child was hidden beneath masks, silenced by fear, ignored in the name of peacekeeping. But when the empath mourns the loss of illusions, they uncover this child again. This child is not meek. She is furious, radiant, untamed. She remembers everything: the betrayals excused, the boundaries abandoned, the truths denied. And yet she holds power unbroken, a power that does not depend on pleasing or forgiving to be worthy of love. This reunion is not sentimental, it is revolutionary. To embrace the inner child is to reclaim the original self, the undamaged spark that never needed masks. The empath realizes that forgiveness was never their duty. It was their delay. It postponed the reckoning with truth, kept them circling the wound rather than cleansing it. But now, the wound has been faced, and the child within can finally breathe. Of course, mourning also means saying goodbye to the versions of others you once loved. You must bury the dream of who they could be, the potential you fell in love with, the promises that never came. You must admit that love cannot replace responsibility. This is one of the heaviest burdens of awakening, to accept that compassion without discernment only prolongs suffering. Yet in mourning this, you honor yourself. The grief also extends to the self you once were, the self that endured too long, that forgave too quickly, that silenced their own needs. But this mourning is not condemnation. It is forgiveness of the most profound kind. Forgiving yourself for mistaking trauma for destiny, for calling neglect unconditional love, for betraying your boundaries in the name of harmony. In this self-forgiveness, you taste freedom deeper than any you have known. And here lies the paradox. As the empath grieves illusions and forgives themselves, they find joy. The mourning clears space for life unburdened by fantasy. It makes way for connections grounded in truth rather than projection. It allows love to flow not from fear, but from fullness. This joy is not naive, it is fierce. It comes not from denying darkness, but from integrating it. In this place, forgiveness changes shape. It is no longer an obligation demanded by others. It becomes a gift granted only when the soul is ready. Forgiveness is no longer about reunion, but about release. You forgive not to keep someone in your life, but to let them go in peace. You forgive not to erase pain, but to honor the lesson it carried. In this way, forgiveness becomes sacred again, rooted not in fear, but in truth. As you sit with this image, imagine yourself at a graveside. You bury illusions one by one, the fantasy of perfect love, the dream of endless harmony, the myth that compassion requires silence. You lay them down with reverence, for they once served you. But as you walk away, you feel lighter. Something new is rising from the soil of mourning, an unshakable loyalty to yourself. This is the essence of individuation, the courage to let die what is false so that what is real may live. The empath, once defined by endless forgiveness, now discovers a new identity, one grounded in discernment, sovereignty, and truth. And as this identity solidifies, the empath begins to understand what Jung called the sacred yes that follows the sacred no. To say no to illusion is to say yes to authenticity. To say no to exploitation is to say yes to life. Mourning, then, is not the end. It is the bridge. On the far side of grief lies a new horizon, the covenant of self-loyalty. It is there that the empath finds liberation, building unshakable boundaries and embodying authentic wholeness. Out of mourning rises something the empath has never truly known: self-loyalty. This is not a fleeting resolution or a motivational phrase. It is a covenant. Self-loyalty is the quiet but unbreakable vow that you will no longer abandon yourself for the comfort of others. It is the final stage of healing, the sacred revolution where forgiveness is no longer your reflex, but your conscious choice. To live in self-loyalty means to hold boundaries without apology. You no longer explain endlessly why you say no. You no longer justify why you choose distance. Your presence is no longer available as an emotional bandage for those who refuse to heal themselves. Instead, your no becomes a mirror in which others must face their own shadows. This is not cruelty. It is truth. In self-loyalty, the empath ceases to be psychic food for the unhealed. Those who once depended on your silence to avoid accountability now tremble in the presence of your clarity. They may accuse you of arrogance or coldness, but these labels are projections. What they call cruelty is actually sovereignty. What they call distance is actually freedom. You are no longer a sponge absorbing poison. You are a mirror reflecting reality. This transformation reshapes every relationship. The ones who only loved you for your weakness fall away, for they can no longer exploit your compliance. But in their absence, something miraculous occurs. Those who honor your strength appear. You recognize them not by their words, but by how your body feels in their presence. Your nervous system rests instead of bracing. Your intuition expands instead of shrinks. These are the connections that emerge when you stop betraying yourself. Living with self-loyalty also transforms forgiveness. It no longer functions as a transaction or a performance. You do not forgive to preserve false harmony. You forgive when your soul is ready, when the truth has been acknowledged, when the lesson has been absorbed. Sometimes this forgiveness is silent, expressed not through words, but through walking away. Sometimes it is not offered at all, because not all wounds deserve reconciliation. This is not bitterness, it is discernment. Self-loyalty requires courage because it means accepting misunderstanding. The world will resist your clarity. Those still dreaming will call you unkind. Those still hiding will call you harsh. But this is the sacred price of wholeness, to be misunderstood by those who still cling to illusion. You are not here to preserve their comfort. You are here to embody truth. And in embodying truth, you shift from empath to mystic. You are no longer the forgiver who absorbs, but the revealer who illuminates. Your presence becomes medicine not because you heal others for them, but because you refuse to participate in their dysfunction. Your silence becomes a sermon, your boundaries become an altar, your clarity becomes a sword. This is the empath transformed, the empath who has become whole. From this place, love itself changes. No longer a currency traded for approval, love becomes essence. You give not because you are afraid to lose connection, but because you are already full. You serve not because you need to be needed, but because you are aligned with truth. This love is fierce and liberating, immune to manipulation. It does not leak into bottomless wells. It flows only where it can nourish. Self-loyalty also means forgiving yourself again and again. Forgiving yourself for the years you stayed, for the silences you swallowed, for the illusions you clung to. Forgiving yourself not as blame, but as release. In this self-forgiveness lies the deepest freedom. The recognition that you never needed their approval, never needed their validation, never needed to contort yourself into masks to be loved. At last, you stand unmasked, unbroken, and unmovable. You do not harden into cruelty. You soften into clarity. You do not lose empathy. You gain discernment. You do not stop loving. You stop lying. This is self-loyalty, and it is the ground upon which authentic wholeness is built. The empath's journey, once defined by endless forgiveness, ends not in bitterness, but in balance. By embracing the shadow, mourning illusions, and honoring the inner child, the empath returns to essence. And in that return, they discover the truest kind of forgiveness, the one offered to themselves for all the years they abandoned their own soul. This is liberation. This is sovereignty. This is the vow. Never again will I betray my truth to preserve illusion. Never again will I abandon myself to be loved. Never again will I wear a mask to be accepted. And with this vow, the empath steps into the world no longer as prey to shadows, but as a beacon of clarity. A lighthouse for those still drowning in codependency, a prophet of the sacred no, a mirror in which the world must finally see itself. This is the final metamorphosis, not into someone new, but into the one they were always meant to be. The story closes not with a grand victory, but with a return. For individuation is always a return, the journey back to the center, to the essence that existed before masks, before betrayals, before illusions. The empath's awakening is not about becoming someone else, but about remembering that their presence was never meant to be consumed by others' shadows, but to illuminate their own. This return is marked by loyalty to the self. Loyalty not in the sense of selfishness, but in the sense of wholeness. It is the refusal to abandon your truth, even when it costs you relationships. It is the courage to grieve illusions without losing faith in love itself. It is the strength to say no without apology, to hold boundaries without shame, to honor anger as much as compassion. The empath who once forgave endlessly now forgives wisely. They forgive not to keep bonds alive, but to release chains. They forgive not to silence truth, but to honor it. They forgive not out of obligation, but out of alignment. And sometimes, they don't forgive at all, and that too is sacred. For true forgiveness cannot be demanded, it can only be earned. This awakening also transforms love. No longer the anxious grasping for approval, love becomes a steady presence. It flows from abundance, not lack. It is given freely, but not recklessly. It honors boundaries as much as connection. It serves truth rather than illusion. Such love is not easily recognized by those still trapped in codependency, but it is unmistakable to those who are ready. The empath, reborn as sovereign, becomes a mirror for others. In their presence, the manipulator sees their hunger. In their silence, the liar hears their own deception. In their clarity, the abuser faces their own shadow. This mirror does not punish, nor does it save. It simply reflects. And in reflection, transformation becomes possible. Of course, this path is not without cost. Awakening often means walking alone, at least for a time. It means being misunderstood, sometimes vilified, by those who relied on your masks. But solitude is not emptiness, it is sanctuary. In solitude, you meet yourself fully, without distortion. And in that meeting, you discover that you are enough. This is the paradox of individuation. To become whole is to risk being misunderstood, but to remain fragmented is to guarantee self-betrayal. The empath chooses wholeness, even at the cost of approval. And in making that choice, they align with a deeper current, the current of truth, which cannot be silenced. So let the masks fall. Let the illusions burn. Let the grief flow. For on the other side waits freedom, the kind of freedom that does not need permission, does not seek validation, does not fear solitude. Freedom born of loyalty to the self. Freedom born of truth. You are not here to be endlessly forgiving. You are here to be whole. And in wholeness, you discover the most profound gift. To walk in the world unmasked, unwavering, and unafraid.